Mais tu vois, tu as tué la reine des ennemis, même pas son bâton. Un bâton, ça remplace là où on trouve les antiquités et ça. Mais il y avait trouvé un autre bâton qui part au nord là-bas, nord-est, où il y a Académie Magique. Il y avait trouvé un bâton là-bas. Mais c'est.
An additional option as a spell blade, as pretty much every spell blade related sorcery is just in melee range, so this is a very nice sorcery to complement the rest of the build with. Now let's work on the spell blade side of things. First of all, we want to get some easy to get and technically powerful spells are the ones you get from the Royal House scroll found in Limgrave right here. Turning the scroll in at any of your favorite sorcerers will grant you the possibility to buy Carrion Slicer and Glint Dagger Stem with great and to fleet cast it and have like a defensive magic spell guarding you to then deal good damage when an enemy approaches you. It's also reliably when you go near your enemy afterwards like that. The northern part of Lernia, you can access Lernia without going through strong builds like this. Then when you're in Lernia, you want to go to this spot right here in Carrion Manor. Can be found near the entrance. You just want to keep going east when you're at the entrance. Ignore the hands as much as you can till you finally arrive at the scarab. Kill the scarab and it will grant you the Carrion Piercer sorcery.
Hello there and welcome friends. This is a guide of everything you should know about how to make a very up-to-date intelligence or sorcery based build for patch 1.05. Now sorceries in Elden Ring have always close range spells including melee spells, medium range spells with very nice area of effect. Now when it comes to class, Astrologer is still the best choice by far. Your starting stats are great with a heavy focus on intelligence, which we need anyways, and your starting spell selection is also the best. The first one is Rock Sling. Not only for my second and third best medium range spells, we have the ever so useful Glintstone Pebble and its upgrade, Great Glintstone Shard. It is true that Glintstone Pebble is just a starter spell, but believe me when I say that it does remain useful for most of the game. The range is decent, the FP cost is low, and the damage is pretty good as well. When it comes to Great Glintstone, 18 instead of 11 go to defeat them. However, you'll notice that some enemies can only be one-shot with Great Glintstone. For the early and mid bosses, go with Rock Sling instead. With that out of the way, let's now cover the best area of effect spells. They actually also have medium range, just like our previous spells. The first one is the ever so powerful Glintstone Arc. This is also a starter spell for the Astrologer, but honestly, it is by far the best area of effect sorcery until around the end game. Even at the end game, it still remains quite powerful, as you can see from these enemies here, who get easily torn to pieces by it. Glintstone Arc not only has decent range, but the arc itself also travels far away and can pierce through multiple enemies. Lastly, the damage is quite good, and the FP cost is pretty low. For the second best area of effect sorcery, we have Adula's Moonblade. This spell unleashes a very powerful great sword arc at the enemies that does travel a bit as well, just like Glintstone Arc, and can pierce through enemies. The reach of the sword is also very wide, and because it is a frost spell, it can actually inflict frostbite upon the enemies for even more damage, and also as a way to reduce their defenses. The only downside of the spell is that, well, it takes quite a while to get. It requires you to be at the very end of running the Witch's Quest. And I also have a guide for the entire Run's Quest that you can check linked to the site here. Now let's talk about the best long-range debuffing spell in the entire game, especially against bosses. Runny's Dark Moon. It does have somewhat slow casting time, but the moon itself that you throw at the enemies can travel for a pretty long path. Once it hits the enemy, the damage is very powerful, but most importantly, it also reduces the bosses or any enemy magical resistance by 20%. This doesn't mean that you deal 20% more damage, rather that it's going to reduce whatever magical defense value they have. The end result, however, is that you will inflict a lot more damage. Lastly, just like a Duelist Moonblade, this is also a cold spell, so can inflict frostbite on the enemy with repeated casts. Usually 2 to 3 casts is more than enough, even against bosses. Just look at how easy it is to handle Malenia's first phase, a boss that spawns somewhat far away from you, by just spamming Runny's Dark Moon. Also, whenever your character is inside the moon, you'll be floating, which makes you immune to ground-based attacks, such as enemy stones. Against bosses, you always want to start by casting this. You can also get Runny's Dark Moon at the end of Runny's quest. And speaking about bosses, of course, let's now cover the ultimate boss-destroying sorcery in Elden Ring, the infamous and ever so powerful Comet Azure. This spell was already extremely powerful back on release, and it has remained unnerfed ever since. So for patch 1.05, it is still at full power. Trust me when I say that this spell alone can easily trivialize almost all of the bosses uses. You might have noticed that whenever you first cast damage, this is why the first thing you should do is empower your Wondrous Physic mix with the Segur casting for 15 whole seconds, more than enough to destroy everything with Comet Azure. You can get this crystal tier by defeating the boss at the Minor Earth tree to the east of the Road of Iniquity Grace at the Mount Ymir region. Now that we have infinite SP for Comet Azure, we need a way to ensure our Comet strikes the enemy. The problem with this spell is that it doesn't have any hyper armor. What this means is any strike that the enemy hits you with, even a light attack, is going to stagger you out of the casting, making your spell fumble, and you'll pretty much have to restart against the boss, because by the time you recover, you'll have wasted your infinite SP buff. There is a very easy way to avoid this, however, and it is all thanks to the Iron Jar Aromatic consumable. While under Iron Jar Aromatic, you actually have infinite poise. That's right, you cannot be staggered at all unless you get hit with some attacks that will always stagger you regardless. Some enemies and bosses have these, but for most of their attacks, you won't be staggered, which means you can remain casting Comet Azure even when being hit. This is why my character here can easily take multiple hits from Malekith in both his first and second phase and still remain casting Comet Azure to easily destroy him. The only downside of Iron Jar is that it basically makes your roll into a fat roll, so the slowest of roll, no matter your equipment load. However, you can easily overcome this penalty by just equipping a light weapon like a dagger with the Bloodhound Step ability, so you can retain your fast dodge with the best invisibility frames possible. As far as spells to increase your damage, we have the very powerful Terra Magica. Whenever you cast this, your character will create a magical sigil, and so long as you are standing inside of it, or for a few seconds after you leave it, you'll increase your magical damage by a massive 35%. The increase is simply huge and can make quite the difference. And here's a fun little fact. Because the sigil is quite long,
holy shit!
you cast Terra Magica right outside of the boss's room.
Putain, ils sont
Then
où?
you enter the boss's room and can resume your Comet Azure. Notice how part of the sigil is sticking out, so you're still benefiting from it just fine. So ideally for bosses, you want to cast Terra Magica, drink Iron Jar Aromatic, enter the boss room, and then you can begin with Comet Azure for a very powerful alpha strike. To talk about the melee range spells, and trust me, some of them can be quite powerful. Mages aren't as frail as you might think on Elden Ring. For my second and third best medium range spells, we have the ever so useful Glintstone Pebble and its upgrade, Great Glintstone Shard. It is true that Glintstone Pebble is just a starter spell, but believe me when I say that it does remain useful for most of the game. The range is decent, the FP cost is low, and the damage is pretty good as well. When it comes to Great Glintstone Shard, it was actually buffed in one of the recent patches, so that it can properly compete with Glintstone Pebble. It does cost a little bit more FP, 18 instead of 11, for a nice boost in damage. Here's when you should consider using either Glintstone Pebble or Shard. If you can shot the enemy with Pebble, then by all means, use the Pebble to defeat them. However, you'll notice that some enemies can only be one-shot with Great Glintstone Shard, and this is where it shines. After all, you don't want to waste time casting either of these twice, for the normal enemies that is. Use the one that allows you to one-shot them, depending on how high their hit points are. For the early and mid bosses, go with Rock Sling instead. With that out of the way, let's now cover the best area of
Mais ils montent pas comment les avoir. Les bêtes ou bien?
range, just like our previous spells. The first one is the Ever So Power. This is also a starter
je vais faire
for
quoi?
Astrologer, but honestly, it is by far the best area of effect sorcery until around the end game. Even at the end game, it still remains quite powerful, as you can see from these enemies here, who get easily torn to pieces by it. Glintstone Arc not only has decent range, but the arc itself also travels far away and can pierce through multiple enemies. Lastly, the damage is quite good, and the FP cost is pretty low. For the second best area of effect sorcery, we have Adula's Moonblade. This spell unleashes a very powerful Great Sword Arc at the enemies that does travel a bit as well, just like Glintstone Arc, and can pierce through enemies. The reach of the sword is also very wide, and because it is a frost spell, it can actually inflict frostbite upon the enemies for even more damage, and also as a way to reduce their defenses. The only downside of this spell is that, well, it takes quite... Now let's talk about the best long-range debuffing spell in the entire game, especially against bosses. Ranni's Dark Moon. It does have somewhat slow casting time, but the moon itself that you throw at the enemies can travel for a pretty long path. Once it hits the enemy, the damage is very powerful. But most importantly, it also reduces the bosses or any enemy magical resistance by 20%. This doesn't mean that you deal 20% more damage, rather that it's